On another topic, Mr. President, I would say that we've learned a lot from the COVID-19. We learned that this particular pandemic targeted more than ever those among us who are up in years, seniors. They were the most vulnerable to the attack of COVID-19. And many folks in their senior years were threatened by and some succumbed to this terrible pandemic. We knew that it was a problem for senior citizens and still do. Yesterday, we had a hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee that called to mind the real question before us. What if this pandemic had targeted our children and babies? What if we knew that the next pandemic was going to be particularly vulnerable, make them particularly vulnerable? Well, I'll tell you, I believe this country, rightly so, would rally behind an effort to do everything we could to protect our children from this looming potential cause of death. Mine is only a hypothetical when it comes to pandemics, but it's not a hypothetical when it comes to the #1 cause of death among children and teenagers in America. The CDC, Centers for Disease Control, just announced within the last 2 weeks that the #1 cause of death is not a pandemic, but guns, firearms, gun violence, and gun deaths. Yesterday, we held a hearing in the Judiciary Committee on the leading cause of death for children in America, guns. In 2020, the most recent year statistics are available. More than 4,300 American babies, children, and teens died from gunfire. During the hearing, we heard from a chorus of witnesses, healthcare witnesses, law enforcement, community violence prevention. They agreed on one basic thing: gun violence is traumatizing an entire generation of American youth. Lawmakers in Congress have a responsibility to stem this tide of violence. One of the witnesses was a young college student from Northeastern University in Boston. He actually grew up on the west side of Chicago. His name was Ernest Willingham. He isn't 20 years old yet, but his testimony sounded like the testimony of a person wise in years. He's already experienced one gun-related tragedy after another. Mr. Willingham told the members of our committee, "I have seen my brother, my father, my cousin, and my best friend become victims of gun violence. This is something that young people should never have to prepare themselves for, yet it remains the lived experience of so many children and youth around our nation." He continued, "We are better than this as a country, and we can solve this crisis." And then he made reference to one basic fact. He says, "Most kids who grew up with me spent more time attending funerals than weddings." That is a sobering statement. And it puts into perspective not only the threat of gun violence and the toll that it's taken, but also the trauma that is visited on so many who are affected by this gun violence. We think instantly of the families of the victims, but trauma goes far beyond that. It extends to families, to witnesses, to so many others whose lives are affected. Mr. President, 2 weeks ago in Chicago, Lurie Children's Hospital convened a group of young people from gun-infested neighborhoods who agreed to meet with me on a private, off-the-record basis. We closed the door, and I looked at their 20 or 30 faces and said, "Tell me what I need to know as U.S. Senator about what it means to grow up in your neighborhood." I can tell you there was an outpouring of statements from every one of them talking about how guns had become such a sad and tragic part of their lives, how many of them had either been shot or lost a family member or a loved one or a friend to gun violence. And they talked about the basics. One young man said, "Senator, we need home training." I said, "What do you mean by home training?" He said, "We need parents who tell us what's right and wrong, tell us what to do. There are no rules. The only rules I find are the rules of the gang on the street. I know what their rules are, but I don't know what the rules are in terms of my own life." I think back on my childhood. Rules? Oh, I had plenty of rules, and most kids do. Clean your plate, clean your room, do your homework, take out the trash, walk the dog. The rules were coming at me all the time, and then I went and attended Catholic grade schools, and believe me, they had even more rules to play by. But the statement by many of these young people is that their lives are adrift in the earliest stages. Some of it reflects parents who are facing poverty, struggling to make ends meet, some working 2 jobs just to get enough money to keep food on the table. They can't be at home and nurturing and guiding these young people as much as they should because they're struggling from paycheck to paycheck. That's a reality of poverty in these neighborhoods. Some families aren't that lucky, and I use that in quotes. Some are dysfunctional. You'll have one parent who is a drug addict and another parent who is inclined toward violence or alcohol, and the child suffers as a result of it. The point I'm getting to is this. That hearing yesterday on gun violence highlighted the reality of what life is like for too many kids in places around America. And it highlighted the importance of doing something. We had a doctor there who was the chairman of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And she said that she sent an email in preparation for her testimony to a number of pediatricians and said, can you share with me any personal experiences with kids who are victims of gun violence? She received 300 replies, which we put in the record of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Sobering statements by doctors of what they faced with kids who had either been victims of gun violence or witnessed it and were trauma victims as a result. That was reality. Ernest Willingham, that I mentioned earlier, talked about what it meant to have this as an integral part of your life growing up. He was one of the lucky ones. He was able to break free from this terrible experience and really start down the path toward a college education. We have the chief of police from Phoenix, Arizona, Chief Williams, who came in. She's a 23-year veteran of the police force and chief in a major city, and she talked about guns and kids and what they face in her city, where she just recently had a number of her policemen who were injured in the line of duty. She spoke to that and said, well, last night there was a shooting and luckily they survived, or I wouldn't be here today. That's the reality of guns in America. And we focus with her on the guns like AR-15s that are showing up at these shootouts and massacres. AR-15 is a, quote, semi-automatic weapon, which means it fires ammunition every time you pull the trigger. But it can be converted into an automatic weapon where you can hold the trigger and it just sprays ammunition at people who are victims. How many of these exist in the United States today, these AR-15 assault weapons that we're seeing in so many of these massacres and shootings? We're not sure. It's somewhere between 10 and 20 million. 10 and 20 million. And I asked what kind of damage is done by these guns to the pediatrician, and she told us it's devastating. Some of the stories that are coming back from these mass shootings now are horrific. I just even hesitate to repeat them, but they have been reported widely in the news, the damage that is done to these poor little bodies in the classroom when these weapons are turned on them. Now, there is no earthly purpose for such a weapon other than the use in the military. It isn't used for sport, it isn't used for hunting, it can't be used for self-defense very effectively, but so many, millions are being sold across America. From my point of view, we should be dealing with that issue directly in the high-capacity magazines that allow these to happen. But unfortunately, we can't at this moment. We don't have the political will to do it in the United States Senate, 50-50 divided. We do have the will to take up the framework which is being worked on at this very moment. It isn't what I want to see, and it isn't what many of us want to see, but it is a step forward, and I commend the senators, the Democrat Chris Murphy, the Republican John Cornyn, for assembling a group of some 20 senators, Democrats and Republicans, who are working on this legislation. It is critically important that they're successful. I know they're having drafting challenges. That's common around here. We have plenty of talented people, and if the members in goodwill sit down, they can work out their differences, and I urge them to do so. Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell publicly support this undertaking. It's one of the rare bipartisan events in the United States Senate, and it's on a critical issue of gun safety. I hope that by next week we can consider this on the floor. And there's another matter that will come before us as soon as today, and it was a matter that was raised in the Judiciary Committee this morning. Today we can start by discharging from the committee a proven battle-tested leader to head the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. His name is Steve Dettelbach. The presiding officer knows him well. He served as a member of his staff as a detailee. He has an exceptional record. You see, it's been 7 years since the Senate has confirmed a director to the ATF, and at a moment when guns are killing our kids at a devastating rate, this office cannot remain vacant any longer. 7 years. How many times have you heard the statement, we don't need any gun laws, we just need to enforce the laws that are on the books? Well, the agency, one of the agencies that has major jurisdiction is Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. It's no coincidence that it's been 7 years since there's been a person in charge of that agency. You need someone to guide the agency to enforce the laws to keep our streets safe. That's very basic. Well, we made a gesture toward that this morning with a vote in the Senate Judiciary Committee. Today we voted for discharge. The Senate will take a critical step toward confirming Mr. Dettelbach. He is the kind of leader our nation needs to get a handle on the crisis of gun violence. Later today, we'll have a vote on the floor here. I hope that we can get bipartisan support for Mr. Dettelbach. Members of law enforcement, mayors across America, and former federal prosecutors all agree it's time that this man, Steve Dettelbach, become the director of ATF. More than 140 former Justice Department officials, including multiple Trump administration appointees, have stepped forward to voice their support for Mr. Dettelbach's nomination. The Judiciary Committee has also received letters of support from multiple former directors and acting directors of the ATF. It's no surprise. As a career prosecutor, Mr. Dettelbach has devoted decades of his life to working alongside law enforcement, including ATF agents, to combat gang violence, gun crimes, and hate crimes. And in every role he's held, Mr. Dettelbach has been squarely focused on protecting the lives of law enforcement officers and the families that they serve. In his own words, quote, "Politics can play no role in law enforcement." He's earned the trust of an amazing list of law enforcement organizations. Listen to the groups that support him taking on this job. The National Sheriff's Association, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the major county sheriffs of America, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, Women in Federal Law Enforcement, the Hispanic American Police Command Officers Association, and many, many more. When a mass shooter tears apart a community like Buffalo, New York, or Uvalde, Texas, ATF agents are among the first federal officers to respond. Let us not wait a minute longer in providing these heroic agents the leader that they deserve. Yes, let's enforce the laws that are on the books. Let's put together the leadership in the ATF to make certain that that is done. I hope my colleagues will join me in voting for Steve Dettelbach's confirmation on the floor of the Senate today. It is timely, it is important, and it's long overdue. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.